I can't imagine the pressure upon his shoulders to make some extremely big calls, such as locking down the country, closing down businesses in order to protect lives. And those decisions would have weighed heavily. He would have had to look at all options. And I think that it would have been natural to have an element of dithering at certain times when you're trying to make sure you make the right call.
Let's start with the COVID inquiry. The COVID inquiry's first report was just published as we were coming on air. Quite a damning report. It says that the government and devolved administrations failed its citizens. It says the country planned for the wrong pandemic. There was too much groupthink. And there's a real sort of clarion call for this new government and for the country going forward to be better prepared for future health pandemics. Jack Straw, what are your reactions to these findings?
Well, Heather Hallett, Lady Justice Hallett, who led the inquiry, is a very experienced and tough former senior judge. And I think I'm sure the government will be well advised and will accept the conclusions of this inquiry. It was perfectly obvious to all of us that there hadn't been proper preparations. I mean, that was why there was a fair degree of sort of anxiety in the population. That was then compounded by I'm afraid, Boris Johnson's inability to take the necessary decisions. So it made for, when people cast their mind back to, it's over 4 years now, to February, March, April 2020, people were dying. And I think that the truth is that COVID caught the world pretty unawares. But there were decisions and plans that could have been put in place, and certainly there were decisions which Boris Johnson and his government should and could easily have made, which would have eased the pandemic effect.
Jonathan, what's your view? I mean, you were a big Boris Johnson fan. You were quite sort of bullish on your stance on lockdowns. What do you think about these findings?
Well, look, I think that it's a plague on all houses across all the devolved nations, as well as obviously central Westminster government too. I think when it comes to Boris, I would suggest that, we hadn't seen a global pandemic like this since the end of the First World War. I can't imagine the pressure upon his shoulders to make some extremely big calls, such as locking down the country, closing down businesses in order to protect lives. And those decisions would have weighed heavily. He would have had to look at all options. And I think that it would have been natural to have an element of dithering at certain times when you're trying to make sure you make the right call and ensure that, it doesn't bring an end to the global economy, doesn't bring an end to people's lives or livelihoods at the end of the day. But what I will say is I think it goes back to the work of the Cabinet Office. I didn't appreciate till I got into Westminster how important the Cabinet Office is. And actually the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, as the title is officially held, is actually probably one of the most important people in Westminster, because you're working cross government departments in order to make sure that you do have those kind of preparednesses for pandemics, for any kind of eventuality in place. And I think that we should probably give much more respect and attention. And I think it's Pat McFadden, if I'm not mistaken, is in that role. And Pat's a very good man, very screwed on, very hardworking. And I'm sure that he will take on board what's been said and work across government departments to make sure we're ready. God forbid anything like this happens again.
Yeah, Pat McFadden has that role. You're right. And that's an incredibly important role to sort of bring together lots of different government departments. And if you're thinking about getting prepared for a pandemic, that's an incredibly cross-cutting piece of work. Just briefly before we move on to our next topic, look, we haven't got a lot of money at the moment. There's not a huge, the finances are very squeezed at the moment. If we are going to get ready and match fit for another pandemic, this will cost money. Jack Straw, have we got enough money to give to this?
I'm not the Chancellor. The cost of planning is relatively small, that's what Heather Hallett's basically talking about. The mindset was wrong. There was too much, as she says, groupthink. So that won't cost, very small beer in terms of just getting a group of people together for plans. Obviously, buying kit and stuff like that for the future would cost money, but again, my guess is that there's a very small proportion of the very large NHS budget.
Okay, Jonathan, briefly, do you think this is money well spent?
Well, I think that this inquiry absolutely is, and I think what Jack is saying is correct, that actually getting systems in place within government by using government officials and government ministers shouldn't cost an awful lot of money. It should actually be costing time at the end of the day, realistically, of those civil servants who are already on payroll. And when it comes to having the resources, the equipment, what I do hope is that as part of Labour's industrial strategy they want to introduce under Jonathan Reynolds, that could be built into those plans. How can the UK not have to rely on purchasing items or vaccines or equipment from overseas?
Yeah.
How can we be ready in this country to quickly manufacture and work with our industries to make sure that's possible?
That's a very, very good point. Look, let's move on to this big gathering at Blenheim Palace, this kind of European sort of political gathering. There's lots on the agenda, but migration is a really important issue. It's something that this new government needs to tackle. It's something that was a huge headache for the last Conservative government. It's something which is affecting many, many countries across Europe. Many political leaders are really troubled by this. Jack, you're a former Home Secretary, you're a former Foreign Secretary as well. How does this new Labour government get these numbers down, particularly on the illegals and the channel crossings? Because you can do lots of processes. There's lots of sort of kind of discussions around getting the right people into place. But my listeners want to know, when is there actually going to be progress?
The only way you can make progress is by cooperation with European and other partners. And that's for the very obvious geographical reason, which is that we are at the end of the migration change. Beyond us, there's the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. And all the illegal migrants who come into this country have come through the continent of Europe, usually through France. So we lost out because of Brexit. I don't want to reheat that argument, but and let me say, measures when we were within the EU weren't brilliant, but they were better. But you've got to get above all further advanced cooperation from France, but also there's cooperation on returns. I had endless problems persuading, for example, Iran, on whom we were actually on better terms than subsequent governments have been because of the change of politics in Iran, to take some people back. And it's even more difficult, for example, with Afghanistan. But you can return some of those people, and certainly others, for example, to Pakistan or other countries with whom we have friendly relations. That's really important.
And Jonathan, what's your view on what needs to be done? I mean, this is a huge issue for the Conservative Party. There was so much heat around this issue, but there was a lot of failure in this issue as well.
Look, totally, the Conservative Party hemorrhaged lots of votes in places like Stoke-on-Trent, either by people sitting at home or going to reform, because ultimately they felt both on legal and illegal migration we hadn't delivered, as we said we would do. But I also think this is Labour's area of weakness at the moment, and where the Conservatives can put pressure in opposition on the government. Look, I don't agree with the idea that somehow having a returns deal where we would accept some migrants who have landed in Europe into our country in exchange for taking some back into the EU is somehow going to deter people who are choosing to put thousands of pounds in the hands of smuggling gangs to come across the channel illegally. Because ultimately, the smuggling gang's whole operational model is we can get you in a boat, we can get you into the waters, and you will get picked up and taken over to the UK. And the fact that Yvette Cooper is now saying that over 90,000 people will be able to claim asylum is only going to aid and abet, in my opinion, the smuggling gang's operational model when they're selling that to those individuals. So, and obviously over 80% now are predominantly young single men. So again, this is migration on a scale that is unprecedented. I totally accept what Jack is saying, that to tackle this, you do have to look downstream. And I think using the foreign aid budget to invest in some of those nations where people are coming from. But I do think a returns deal with Iran, with Afghanistan, would be very challenging in these circumstances, particularly with who's running them. Because ultimately, I think you'd have the ECHR, and obviously I'm someone who advocates for us to withdraw from it, but the ECHR would get in the way because of the human rights that would eventually be exploited in those nations by people.
Jack, do you want to come back to that?
Yes. The key, as I've been saying, is cooperation with other EU countries. On Yvette saying she's going to allow those 90,000 asylum seekers who are currently in limbo, because the government said if you land illegally, and by definition, almost every single asylum seeker has got into the country by unlawful means. If you the last Conservative government said they wouldn't allow them to make applications to remain. The result of that,
okay,
we've got 90,000 people in limbo, on the public purse, and that is crackers.